In this chapter, we're going to push things a little bit harder with distortion, seeing how we can bring extra aggression to an electronic dance music production. And in particular, the reason why my mind has been drawn in that direction is because one of the sounds within this project is more aggressive than everything else. I've got some drums here, which are all in blue. I've got a kick, a snare, and some hats. And then I've got this sound that I've called smudge. And what I'm going to do when we listen through the track is I'm just going to solo that on the sort of second playback so we can hear that sound in isolation. And then we'll see that at the moment it's got kind of a white, noisy, aggressive quality, which is kind of missing from the rest of the track. And what I want to do is to take the other sounds in the mix and pull them more in the direction of the kind of implied aggression of that sound. Okay, and actually, before we start thinking about adding distortion, I'm going to just play back the beginning again, but without that sound, so we can hear how much less aggressive it sounds. Okay, so what I want to do is to sort of bring a little bit more of this kind of white, noisy, crackly, driven quality to the other sounds within the mix. And what I'm going to do is to think about those other sounds in two groups. I'm going to think about the rest of the drums, and then I'm going to think about all of the synths in one group as well. So let's start with the other drums. For a moment, I'm going to just bypass or mute this smudge sound, and I'm going to take the synths out as well. And what I'm going to do is to assign all of these three tracks to what Logic calls a track stack. So in other words, an auxiliary bus. If you're not working in Logic, don't worry, just simply assign all of those sounds to an auxiliary bus. I'm going to call this drums, so that effectively all of the sounds are being routed into one place. And when we press play, we'll hear all of them playing back through this bus. Okay, what this allows me to do if I come into the mixer is to think about these sounds as one thing rather than as three separate tracks. And in particular, what I want to do is to set up what we call a parallel distortion treatment from this bus. I'm going to send this sound to bus number 2. And what I then have a chance to do is to turn up the send level to that auxiliary, which is where I'm going to add some extra aggression and sort of trash to this drum group. Now to do that, what I'm going to do is to select the Byte plugin made by Native Instruments, where I have a chance to add some bit crushing. What bit crushing does, if we pull the resolution of a sound down, is to add kind of white, noisy, aliasy overtones. And that's kind of what I'm hearing in the smudge track. And I want a little bit more of that in the other drum sounds as well. And I'm going to use bit crushing to achieve that. So what I'm going to do is to pull the sound down in terms of its sort of sample rate. So we're getting a slightly more trashed sort of sound. I'm going to pull the bit rate down a little bit as well. And what that's going to allow me to do is to then increase the amount of crunch, which is where we're going to hear some extra white noise coming into the sound as well. And we'll just increase jitter, which just makes the sample rate a little bit more variable, just a little bit less predictable. Okay, now this is a much more extreme distortion than we've seen in other chapters, but what I'm getting is exactly the quality that I wanted, this kind of white, noisy, crunchy overtone. Now, the advantage of setting this processor up in this way on its own auxiliary is that I've now got a chance to determine how much volume I want of this particular processor. I've obviously got my send level to it here, and then effectively its fader over here determines its return level. In other words, I've got a chance to decide whether I want none of this effect, lots of it, or somewhere in between. So what I can do is put the smudge track back in with the other drums and see if I can find a kind of noisy treatment for this bit crusher, which feels like it sits along the, alongside the smudge track at about the right volume. If I turn it off altogether, we'll hear the smudge track, we'll hear the drums exactly as they are right now, and then what we can do is to begin to introduce this effect. Okay, what I've done there is just to make a little bit of an adjustment, because what I was finding with the original setting was that the kind of crunch was producing a kind of white noisy overtone which was lasting too long. I don't want to just completely decimate this and fill up every single space. So what I've done is to slightly rein in the crunch and slightly pull down the expand dial as well. And what they're doing, those two dials, is to just pull in the length of the kind of white noisy overtone so it feels like it fits that smudge track a little bit better. And even at this incredibly low level, what we've now got is a little bit more character and power in the other drum sounds, so hopefully they match that smudge track a little bit better. Now, one thing I could do when introducing the synths would simply be to feed them into the same auxiliary. I could set up exactly the same treatment and send all of those sounds to the same byte track. In fact, I'm just going to name that so I remember exactly what that is. That's byte there. But what I actually want to do is to create a slightly different treatment for the synths. So I'm going to unmute these other tracks. And what, in fact, we're going to do is, again, assign these into their own track stack again so that all of the synths are coming out of the same outputs. So I'm just going to call this synths. This, as we'll see, has been routed through to bus number 3. So bus 1 is now the drums, bus 2 is the byte track, and bus 3 is the dry synths track. Again, if I solo this, we should just hear the synths. Okay, and what I'm going to do here, as I did with the drums, is I'm going to send this to a new auxiliary bus. This is going to be bus number 4, the next available bus. And here what I'm going to do is to set up a decapitator treatment. So again, I'm going to just drop down here, come into Sound Toys and find decapitator. Now what I want here is some extra kind of top end in this sound, and the style or the algorithm that I like to use when I'm adding sort of top end crunch is this EMI channel, this E setting here. Now again, what I've got here is drive control, which is linked to the output. The harder I push the drive, the more the output level drops. But I want something pretty extreme. So what I'm actually going to do is to experiment with what happens when I turn on the punish button. What this does is to give me an additional 20 decibels of extra volume. And what I'm going to do is to bias the tone a little bit more towards bright frequencies and scoop out some of the low end content. Remember, this auxiliary bus contains not only this little plucky synth here, but also this kind of really low-end sound. It's got a lot of sub bass in it. It's got some brighter overtones as well, and it's those ones I want to add a little bit more fizz to without over-complicating or over-bloating the bottom end. So hopefully we'll be able to do that by sort of slightly attenuating the low-end frequencies with the low-cut dial over here. Okay, so let's have a listen to what we've got. Remember, this channel is on bus 4. I'm going to call this decap. And what I obviously have a chance to do, as I did with the other synth, with the other drum tracks, is to bring in the amount of this effect that I want. But to start with, let's just sort of set it here at a probably too loud level and just see what it's bringing to the synths right now. Okay, now you can actually see that one of these sounds is overloading the output. There isn't actually the decapitator channel, which is over here. This is actually just the dry level of this synth. So what I really need to do is to pull that level down a little bit, and we could do that by selecting all of the tracks that aren't in the auxiliary groups. Just literally just select all of these tracks and just pull their volume down so that everything is coming down by a certain amount of volume so that we're not actually adding distortion at source. And that's really important. Lots of synths are by design really loud. They want to impress you when you first fire up their presets. And quite often you'll find that their volumes overload the output channels, which isn't very helpful. And that was happening here. So what I've done is just to pull down the volume of all of those tracks so that the distortion that we're hearing is the distortion that we want to add rather than the stuff that's happening sort of just by default. Okay, let's listen to this again. Okay, so that's clearly too much level, but remember, because I've set this up the way that I have, I've actually got independent control over how much of this signal I want, just as I have with the drums as well. I've got a drum return channel here, which is allowing me to dial in the amount of byte that I want and the amount of decap channel here, the decapitator on the synths. So remember, if I turn both of these down to 0, we've effectively got our original mix. But as I introduce these, what we're getting is these super aggressive channels, which are feeding in underneath the dry signals. And we're really hearing that decapitator in the kind of reverb tail of this sound here, which is introduced for the second half. Okay, so what we can see is that when we group sounds together like this and we create these parallel channels, what we can do is to create these really ultra distorted, much pushier, harder distortion treatments, which we're then able to sort of dial into the mix at the level that we need them. Look how low these faders are. Even a small amount is giving us loads of extra aggression and power. And that's working really nicely in a track which kind of is benefiting from this kind of propulsion. And remember, this was driven by a sort of creative decision to focus on one sound within the mix and to take our kind of sonic cues from it. And it works really nicely to try and match the character of some tracks within your mix to others which maybe have got a little bit more vibe to start with.